The first question from John Newman. Very interesting talk, Peter. Thank you. I think the Prabha svara passage is also found in the Gandhari scroll of the Prajnaparamita, which, if memory serves, has been C14 dated to around the 1st century CE. Also, I believe some scholars have argued that the Pali Prabhasaram passages are relics of Mahayana in Sri Lanka. Can you comment on that theory?
Okay, thank you. There are, I think, 2 questions here, and one, the reference to the early 1st century BCE, possibly Prajnaparamita. So that is fine. There's no reason it should not be an early idea. And as I said, these circulated as ideas, not as texts. So it's finding this Prabhasra idea, finding its way into a early Prajnaparamita in the 1st century BCE is, to me, fine. The second part, that it's a relic, these ideas are relics of Mahayana in Sri Lanka, I would not really say. We don't have a good history of that. Mahayana was prevalent, Mahayana and also some tantric practice, esoteric practice, was widespread and even prevalent in Sri Lanka. Don't ask me when, let's say 5th, 6th, 7th century, 8th century, around that period. So that is a later period that there was explicit Mahayana practice, we know from inscriptions and so on. That also is no problem. But I think that the Prabhasra passages are much earlier than that, and they spread through different schools and Nikayas.
So Prabhasra statement would have definitely preceded the inscription, the writing down of the Pali canon, I suppose.
Yes, it has to, yeah, as a set of ideas and a set of remembered texts, because let's remember that Buddhist texts or literature, or orature as we may call it, were transmitted for roughly 500 years after the Buddha died. Buddha passed away, and then the Buddhist texts were not written down till, let's say, we now have some evidence for the 1st century BCE, and certainly 1st century CE, the text began to be written down. So we have 400, 500 years of oral transmission. And during that, the scriptural collections were formed, and I believe they were formed and they were standardized by the different Nikayas, who by that time were spread to different parts of India. So different schools transmitted their memory. They were the guardians of the heritage of the Buddha's words, and they transmitted them, and I think fairly continually edited them, updated them, and eventually began to write them down. So that was a very long process, and certainly the Prabhasra and other teachings. We talk a lot, we opinionated scholars talk about this text is early, this text is late, but that's often a kind of a subjective. We don't have any real dates for the different sets of ideas. We have, if we have some Gandhari texts now that are datable in terms of their physical carbon dating and so on, or in terms of their script, their paleography or language, we are getting somewhere, and this is new. So we can make sort of newer chronologies are there. Tibetan translations, of course, are much later, and even the earlier Chinese translations are still, what, 600-700 years after the Buddha. So you have to always sort of factor in this idea, which is hard for us to understand. Very briefly, comparative research, you look at the Christian and Jewish traditions. The scriptures do involve, I think, some concepts, some notions of orality, certainly, but basically the gospel, the teaching of Jesus, is very much connected with written records. And the 4 books, I guess it is, of the 4 great disciples are conceived of as written documents from the beginning. And in the Christian art, you always see the 4 great disciples, often see the 4 great disciples, each of them holding a pen or a stylus and writing in a book. Now, art and reality intersect in various ways and do not, and can conflict in various ways. And it cannot be used as any kind of absolute evidence. But we should say that I don't think there's hardly any Buddhist representations of Shariputra or Ananda or others holding pens and writing down, because the emphasis is always on this oral transmission. In fact, there are a few Chinese, late Chinese, but that mean maybe 10th century or later, paintings that show the Buddhist council, so-called, or the formation of the canon with the monks writing down Chinese characters in Chinese style books. These are, of course, later reconceptualizations. So these are all very fascinating fields of research endeavor. And I think we have to re-examine a lot of the early materials. And we have to certainly, it's very important to mention the Gandhari manuscripts, which have really changed our understanding of the development of Buddhist scriptures very, very much, very important.